Hello, my name is Alyssa Pearson, and I'm the Abash Collections Access Librarian at the Mercantile Library. If you haven't already, please make sure you've watched the introductory tour video in part 1 and the video on how to use our digital library. In this presentation, we're going to learn about American slave narratives. We will define what they are and dive into the history around them. We will discuss the importance of studying these narratives and examine what they can teach us about the lives of enslaved peoples and the history of the United States as a whole. We'll go over a few vocabulary terms throughout the presentation and lay out some essential questions for you to consider. Later, you'll find a follow-up assignment in which you'll compare and contrast two narratives set in St. Louis. The Mercantile Library holds many rare copies of slave narratives featured in this presentation and the follow-up assignment, but they are extremely fragile. Luckily for us, these important texts are available completely online. Let's begin. First, let's define what slave narratives are. Slave narratives are stories about the personal experiences of people who escaped from slavery to freedom. Sometimes these stories are called freedom narratives, but usually they are called slave narratives because they tell stories about what people experienced and witnessed while they were enslaved. These narratives had an important mission: to reveal the brutal realities of slavery and convert people to become anti-slavery themselves. From 1760 to the end of the Civil War in the United States, around 100 narratives of formerly enslaved people were published. At least 50 more people wrote or dictated their stories in books after slavery was abolished in 1865. To dictate a story means to speak for someone else to write down your words. Because learning to read and write was forbidden and cruelly punished by enslavers, dictating stories was common for many people who escaped slavery. Their narratives became very famous in the years leading up to the Civil War. They were advertised in abolitionist press and sold at anti-slavery meetings around the world, selling tens of thousands of copies. Later on, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Federal Writers Project gathered narratives from 2,500 former enslaved people, whose stories fill 18 volumes. In August 1831, in Southampton County, Virginia, a Black preacher named Nat Turner led the most successful uprising of enslaved people in U.S. history. An uprising is an act of resistance or rebellion. Before being captured by state and federal troops, Turner's rebellion executed 60 white people, including Nat's enslaver and family. Turner was hanged on November 11, 1831, but before he was executed, he dictated a narrative titled The Confessions of Nat Turner. It is estimated that 50,000 copies of Turner's narrative were printed, making it the most widely read African American slave narrative of its time. Enslavers reacted to Nat Turner's uprising with violent rage. They murdered 120 Black people in retaliation. Slave state legislatures passed new laws banning the education of enslaved and free Black people, restricted their ability to gather in groups, and required white ministers to be present at Black worship services. Abolitionists in the North proclaimed their dedication to ending slavery immediately. One of the most famous abolitionists was William Lloyd Garrison, a journalist who founded the American Anti-Slavery Society. Free Black people in the North supported the society by editing newspapers, holding conventions, sending out petitions, and investing their money in protests. This generation of Black and white abolitionists began seeking out and publishing the narratives of formerly enslaved people. Most of the major authors of African American literature before 1865, such as Frederick Douglass, William Wells Brown, and Harriet Jacobs, began their writing careers with narratives of their experience as enslaved people. Slave narratives helped launch the national debate over slavery in the 1850s. The most widely read American novel of the whole century was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852. The author was deeply influenced by her reading of slave narratives. Now, let's take a look at two famous examples of slave narratives. In 1845, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself, became an international bestseller. Douglass escaped slavery in Maryland and spent 4 years giving abolitionist speeches before writing his story. During the first 5 years of its publication, his narrative sold at least 30,000 copies. Douglass's second book, My Bondage and My Freedom, looked more closely at racism among white people in free states, even the ones who considered themselves abolitionists. Harriet Jacobs was the first known African American enslaved woman to write her own narrative. She challenged common ideas about slavery and freedom in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself, which she wrote in 1861. Jacobs' narrative shows how sexual exploitation made slavery especially oppressive for Black women. She described how she fought back and gained freedom for herself and her 2 children. Jacobs showed how wrong people were to think of enslaved women only as helpless victims. Now, let's take a look inside these books. What does the title page of a slave narrative tell us? The title page of a slave narrative tells us the role that the subject in the narrative's title actually played in the writing of the narrative. Frederick Douglass's narrative, for example, has a subtitle that says, "Written by himself." Harriet Jacobs' subtitle states that it was written by herself. Why do you think it would be so important for readers of the 1800s to see the "written by himself" or herself subtitle in these narratives? Why is authorship of one's own story so important? What do the prefaces and introductions tell us? Usually, antebellum slave narratives carried a Black message inside a white envelope. The word antebellum means before the war, so here we are talking about narratives written before the American Civil War. So what does that mean, a Black message inside a white envelope? Well, white publishers would create a preface or introduction written by white people to assure white readers that the Black narrator was reliable and had good character. This is a reminder that even white Northerners who were against slavery still held deeply racist beliefs. Examples of white prefaces to Black texts are William Lloyd Garrison's in Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass and Lydia Marie Child's in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. In both cases, the white authors felt they had to confirm the truth of the narratives that follow them. Why do you think the publishers felt they needed these prefaces? How do most slave narratives end, and how do they portray life in the North? Most slave narratives end when the narrator reaches freedom in a northern state. In some well-known narratives, reaching freedom is signaled not simply by reaching the so-called free states, but by renaming oneself, finding employment, marrying, and in some cases, becoming an anti-slavery activist. Very few slave narratives discuss racial discrimination and injustice that free African Americans endured when they reached the North. As you'll see in the follow-up assignment, things get even more complicated when narratives take place in a border state like Missouri, which did not join the Confederacy, but did allow slavery. Most slave narratives do not give Black authors the space to detail their lives as free people. The focus is on the gruesome details of slavery. This is absolutely essential information to know. At the same time, it is important we understand that slave narratives give us an incomplete picture of African American lives during this time. People did not stop writing slave narratives after slavery was abolished. In fact, 70 years after slavery was abolished, the government recorded the stories of elderly people who had experienced slavery. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Federal Writers Project recorded more than 2,500 first-person accounts of slavery and 500 black and white photographs of formerly enslaved people. People in their 80s, 90s, and even over 100 years old told stories of what they experienced and witnessed, just as people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs had almost 100 years earlier. On the Library of Congress website, you can find the narratives listed by the state in which the interviews took place, and then by the last name of the person interviewed. There are many interviews from people in St. Louis and throughout the state of Missouri. You'll be able to find the link to these narratives under the Additional Resources section. What similarities do you think the 1930s interviews may have to the slave narratives from the 1850s? What about differences? Over the next several slides, we're going to learn about the lives of William Wells Brown and Archer Alexander, two men who experienced slavery in St. Louis. Their narratives can be found in the Mercantile Library's special collections. In the follow-up assignment, you'll read and answer questions about their personal narratives. Pictured here is a map from our collections by Julius Hatawa. This is St. Louis as it appeared in 1846, around the time William Wells Brown and Archer Alexander lived here. William Wells Brown was born into slavery around 1814 in Lexington, Kentucky, the son of Elizabeth, an enslaved black woman, and a white relative of the man who enslaved them. The man who enslaved William was named Dr. John Young. In 1816, Dr. Young took William and his family to Missouri Territory. They settled on a farm along the Missouri River in what is now Montgomery County. In 1827, they moved to a farm outside of St. Louis, where William was frequently hired out to local merchants and sometimes steamboat captains, including slave traders. William was observant and learned a lot about the world through the people he met during this time. In 1832, William attempted to escape slavery with his mother, but they were both caught and taken back to St. Louis. William was sold to a merchant, and his mother was put on a boat to New Orleans. He never saw her again. He was later sold to a riverboat captain named Enoch Price. On January 1, 1834, while docked in Cincinnati, Ohio, William finally escaped at the age of 20. He was helped by a Quaker man named Wells Brown, and William took his name. Brown made his way to Cleveland, where he spent years working on a Lake Erie steamboat to help others escape slavery into Canada. While in Cleveland, he met and married Elizabeth Schooner. The couple had 3 daughters, one of whom died shortly after birth. His surviving daughters were named Clarissa and Josephine. 2 years after his marriage, Brown moved to Buffalo, New York, where he began his career in the abolitionist movement by attending meetings of the Western New York Anti-Slavery Society. He boarded anti-slavery speakers at his home, lectured at local abolitionist gatherings, and traveled to Cuba and Haiti to explore emigration possibilities. In the summer of 1843, Buffalo hosted a national anti-slavery convention and the National Convention of Colored Citizens. Brown attended both meetings, sat on several committees, and became friends with a number of black abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass. Brown was invited to speak before the American Anti-Slavery Society at its 1844 annual meeting in New York City. In May 1847, he was hired as a Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society public speaker. Brown moved to Boston, and by the end of the year, he had published his narrative. In 1849, he went on a lecture tour of Great Britain and remained overseas until 1854. He was thrilled by the tour. He had time to write and made many friends. Unfortunately, he and his wife divorced during this time. But there was something else that kept him from returning to the United States. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, which made it extremely dangerous for him to travel back home. The act set severe punishments for anyone who helped an enslaved person escape from slavery. It also gave people the power to order the return of refugees to their enslavers, which meant they could be kidnapped even after reaching northern states. I want to point out that I'm referring to people who ran away from slavery as refugees, not as fugitives. The reason is this: the word fugitive can be used to describe a criminal running from the law to avoid justice. This does not accurately describe people running from slavery. A refugee is someone who flees to escape danger, which is a more accurate way to describe them. British abolitionists were concerned for Brown's safety, and so they purchased his freedom in 1854. By the time he returned to America, he had written Clotel, the first novel ever published by an African American. He also started publishing his speeches. The publication of those works, along with a play and a collection of anti-slavery songs, gave him the reputation of a pioneer in Black literature. Brown lived in the Boston area for the rest of his life and produced 3 major volumes of Black history. He continued to travel, lecture, and write. William Wells Brown completed his last book, titled My Southern Home, or The South and Its People, in 1880, and he passed away in 1884. Archer Alexander was born into slavery on a Virginia plantation around the year 1810 to parents named Alec and Chloe. When Archer was a teenager, his enslavers sold his father in order to settle a debt. 2 years later, when the plantation owner died, Archer Alexander was willed to his eldest son. They moved to Missouri in 1831, where Archer was often hired out to brickyards in St. Louis. Archer met and married an enslaved woman named Louisa and started a family while in St. Louis. Before the Civil War, Archer Alexander carefully listened to political discussions happening around him and determined that he would flee from his life in slavery if he ever had the chance. In 1861, Alexander secretly notified a group of Union troops that a bridge they intended to use had been sabotaged by Confederate sympathizers. He was suspected of being the source of this information and had to flee the farm. Alexander was captured by slave catchers, but he broke free and returned to St. Louis. Alexander tried to convince the U.S. Provost Marshal in St. Louis to give him his protection papers, but he was left in limbo. He went downtown to look for work in one of the public markets. It was there that he was hired as a servant by Abigail Elliott. Abigail's husband was a man named William Greenleaf Elliott, a well-known preacher in St. Louis who was also one of the founders of Washington University. The Elliots suspected Alexander was a refugee of slavery because he was so private about his personal life. Elliott had pledged to never return an enslaved refugee to their enslaver, so he obtained a certificate to keep Alexander for 30 days, and quickly wrote his enslaver offering to buy Alexander's freedom from him. The man who enslaved Alexander turned down the offer, vowing he would have the slave back. 2 days before the expiration of his certificate, Alexander was found by slave catchers. Elliott managed to find Alexander and keep him safe. Alexander and his wife were reunited along with some of their 10 children, but only for a short time, as Louisa tragically died from an unknown illness in 1866. A few years later, Archer Alexander's life took an unusual turn. In 1869, Elliott was working on funding an emancipation memorial featuring a statue of Lincoln in Washington, D.C. Fundraising had begun with a $5 donation from a former enslaved woman named Charlotte Scott. All of the initial funds raised were donations from formerly enslaved people, later matched by donations from the Western Sanitary Commission, a St. Louis war relief agency. Elliott's group wanted to have a real freedman pose for the memorial. Elliott gave the sculptor Thomas Ball a photo of Alexander, and he was chosen as the model. The memorial shows Abraham Lincoln holding a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, reaching out a hand and freeing an African American enslaved man modeled on Archer Alexander. The man is depicted on one knee, about to stand up, with one fist clenched, shirtless and broken shackles at the president's feet. The memorial was dedicated by Frederick Douglass in 1876. Letters later revealed that Douglass felt the memorial did not tell the whole story of emancipation. Some things to consider about this memorial. Most of the funding came from formerly enslaved Black people, and yet the artist of the sculpture was white. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, held in his right hand, never really freed Alexander. He had to free himself through his own will and determination. as did so many thousands of other enslaved people across the United States. Today, the monument is viewed as disrespectful to Alexander and all enslaved people who fought for their own freedom, and there have been calls for its removal. Keep all of this in mind when you hear the following. William Greenleaf Eliot wrote the slave narrative about Archer Alexander's life in 1885, 6 years after Alexander died in St. Louis. Why do you think this information is important to know? One final interesting fact about Archer Alexander. In 2018, Muhammad Ali's family discovered through genetic testing that Ali is Alexander's 3 times great-grandson. Let's review the vocabulary terms from today. Slave narratives are stories about the personal experiences of people who escaped from slavery to freedom. To dictate means to speak for someone else to write down your words. An uprising is an act of resistance or rebellion. Antebellum means the time period before the Civil War. The term fugitive can mean a criminal running from the law to avoid justice. And the word refugee means someone who flees to escape danger. Now let's review the essential questions from today. First, what does the title page of a slave narrative tell us? The title page of a slave narrative tells us the role that the subject in the narrative's title actually played in the writing of the narrative. What do the prefaces and introduction tell us? White publishers would create a preface or introduction written by white people to assure white readers that the black narrator was reliable and had good character. This reminds us that white Northerners who were against slavery still held deeply racist beliefs and did not fully trust black narrators to tell their stories on their own terms. How do slave narratives typically end, and how do they portray life in the North? Most slave narratives end when the narrator reaches freedom in a northern state. Very few slave narratives discuss racial discrimination and injustice that free African Americans endured when they reached the North. What can we learn from slave narratives, and what do they leave out? Slave narratives are extremely important in our understanding of slavery in the United States. They detailed the brutal experiences of enslaved African Americans and brought that information to people around the country to help the anti-slavery cause. Slave narratives had a crucial impact in the abolitionist movement and opened white Americans' eyes to the struggle for black freedom. In some cases, black narrators who told their stories went on to national and international fame, writing and speaking out against slavery, such as Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown. However, most slave narratives do not give black authors the space to detail their lives as free people. The focus is on the gruesome details of slavery. This is absolutely essential information to know. At the same time, it's important we understand that slave narratives give us an incomplete picture of African American lives during this time. Archer Alexander did not get to tell his story in his own words. His image was used in a monument that also did not tell the full story of his life or of black freedom in America. Thank you so much for listening and learning along with me today. Make sure you head over to the follow-up assignment where you will read, analyze, compare, and contrast excerpts from the narratives of William Wells Brown and Archer Alexander. I will also link to additional resources for you to continue your exploration of the topics we discussed today, including online versions of many slave narratives. Please contact me by email with any questions. I look forward to learning more with you in the future.